In the vast wilderness of the Serengeti, where golden grasslands stretched endlessly under the scorching sun, a young cheetah named Zuri roamed with her brother, Keanu. They had been inseparable since birth, growing up under the care of their mother, who had taught them the ways of survival. Their sleek, spotted coats blended seamlessly with the dry savanna, allowing them to move unnoticed as they stalked prey. However, life in the wild was never easy. When they were just 1 year old, their mother was killed by a group of aggressive hyenas, leaving them to fend for themselves. Despite their grief, Zuri and Keanu had no choice but to rely on each other. They became skilled hunters, learning to take down small antelopes and hares to survive. Seasons change, and the land became drier than ever. Water sources disappeared, and prey grew scarce. The once thriving plains now felt desolate, with animals migrating in search of better conditions. Zuri and Keanu realized they could no longer survive in their birthplace. They needed to find a new home, a place where water was abundant and danger was minimal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the siblings stood atop a rocky outcrop, gazing into the distance. The wind carried the scent of dust and distant herds, but it also carried something else, whispers of a land far away, where rivers still flowed, and food was plentiful. Keanu nudged Zuri. "We have to leave," he said firmly. "If we stay here, we won't make it through the next season." Zuri hesitated. She had never known anything beyond the plains they called home. But deep down, she understood her brother was right. If they stayed, starvation was inevitable. With heavy hearts but determined spirits, the two cheetahs set off under the cover of night, their journey into the unknown beginning with cautious yet hopeful steps. Zuri and Keanu continued their journey, leaving behind the sparse grasslands and entering a parched land where the cracked earth stretched endlessly under the scorching sun. The heat pressed down relentlessly, and sources of water became increasingly scarce. Their steps grew heavier after days without proper nourishment. It had been 2 days since they last found food, surviving only on small puddles trapped in the crevices of the dry ground. Zuri felt her body weakening, but stopping was not an option. Suddenly, Keanu halted, his ears perked up, and his sharp gaze fixed on a withered bush ahead. A familiar scent reached his nose, the smell of fresh meat and blood. Zuri sensed it too. Without hesitation, she crouched low, creeping forward cautiously. Through the brittle branches, a sight made her heart race. 3 hyenas were feasting on the carcass of an antelope. They tore into the flesh greedily, the sound of cracking bones echoing in the stillness of the barren land. Hunger surged through Zuri's veins, urging her to charge in and fight for the food. But Keanu remained still, his golden eyes wary. Hyenas were not natural enemies of cheetahs, but they hunted in packs, outnumbering and overpowering lone competitors. Zuri hesitated. If they left with nothing, they wouldn't survive much longer. A light breeze stirred the air, carrying their scent toward the scavengers. One hyena immediately lifted its head, nostrils flaring, its beady eyes locked onto the bush where they were hiding. Within seconds, the other 2 stopped eating, their ears twitching. Then, they charged. Zuri and Keanu spun around and sprinted. They knew hyenas weren't as fast as cheetahs, but they were tireless. If the chase dragged on, exhaustion would be their downfall. Keanu veered left while Zuri darted right, forcing the hyenas to split up. 2 pursued Keanu, while the third targeted Zuri. Zuri pushed her speed to the limit, her heart pounding, but the terrain ahead suddenly changed. A deep crevice appeared before her, not impossibly wide, but far enough to make the jump dangerous. There was no time to reconsider. She gathered all her remaining strength and leapt. Her paws landed on the other side, skidding on the loose soil before regaining balance. She turned back just in time to see the hyena skid to a stop at the edge. Growling in frustration, it paced back and forth, snarling, but eventually gave up. Zuri panted heavily. She was safe, but where was Keanu? She scanned the horizon desperately, but there was no sign of him. Fear clawed at her chest. Now, she was alone in the vast wilderness, where danger lurked in every shadow. Zuri scanned the dry land, her sharp eyes searching for any sign of Keanu. The last time she saw him, he was running for his life. 2 hyenas in relentless pursuit. Now, the eerie silence of the savannah stretched before her. The sun had almost disappeared beyond the horizon. casting long shadows across the cracked earth. She couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The night brought new dangers, lurking predators and a cold that seeped into the bones. Lowering her head, she sniffed the air, but all she could detect was the dry scent of dust and scorched grass. There was no trace of Keanu. She needed to think, if he had been chased to his limit, where would he go? Retracing her steps, she followed the faint paw prints left in the dirt. When she reached the deep crevice she had leapt over earlier, she hesitated. Keanu might not have taken the same risk. Perhaps he had turned in a different direction, avoiding the hazardous terrain. As she moved forward, small clues began to appear. Deep claw marks gouged the earth, as if something had struggled desperately. Nearby, a few tufts of golden fur clung to a thorny bush. A wave of unease washed over her. She followed the faint drag marks imprinted in the dirt, spotting small drops of blood scattered on the rocks. Her heartbeat quickened. The farther she went, the clearer the trail became. When she finally reached a cluster of large stones, she knew she was close. A faint growl broke the silence. It was weak, labored, but unmistakable. Zuri lowered herself to the ground, muscles tensed, as she crept toward the source of the sound. Peering through a narrow gap between the rocks, she saw him. Keanu lay on his side, his breathing shallow. One of his hind legs was twisted unnaturally, and fresh bite marks marred his shoulder. His golden fur was stained with dirt and dried blood. But they weren't alone. A hyena stood a few meters away, its eyes locked onto Keanu's motionless body. The scars on its side suggested that Keanu had fought back. But instead of retreating, the predator was waiting, patiently, like a hunter observing a dying prey. Zuri's body tensed. She couldn't leave Keanu behind. But she couldn't charge in recklessly either. A light breeze swept through the air, carrying the sharp scent of blood. There was no time to hesitate. Without warning, Zuri lunged, her sudden attack catching the hyena off guard. It flinched but quickly retaliated with a vicious snap of its jaws. Zuri twisted away just in time, kicking up a cloud of dust with her claws. The hyena recoiled, its vision momentarily obscured by the swirling sand. Zuri seized the brief opening. Retreating to Keanu's side, she braced herself, pressing against his trembling body. Keanu struggled to his feet, every movement laced with pain. Together, they staggered away, leaving the hyena watching from the shadows, torn between continuing the hunt or abandoning it. As the twilight faded into darkness, Zuri pressed on, supporting Keanu with each careful step. The journey ahead remained uncertain. But for now, they needed shelter, before the night swallowed them whole. Darkness settled over the savannah as Zuri and Keanu stumbled forward. They were both exhausted, especially Keanu, whose every step sent a tremor of pain through his injured body. The wounds on his shoulder and leg slowed him down, his breathing heavy and labored. Yet he pushed himself to follow Zuri. Zuri stayed alert, scanning the surroundings. The night brought dangers beyond predators. The sharp drop in temperature made the air bite through their fur. The cold could sap their strength further if they didn't find shelter soon. Ahead, a dense thicket of bushes loomed in the dim moonlight. Zuri hurried toward it, hoping it would provide them with some cover. She paused at the edge, scenting the air. No immediate signs of predators. But caution was necessary. She stepped inside first, testing the ground with her claws, before signaling to Keanu to follow. Keanu collapsed onto the soft earth, his eyelids drooping from exhaustion. Zuri settled beside him, ears perked, listening intently. In the distance, the eerie laughter of hyenas echoed across the plains, a chilling reminder that the night was far from safe. They were on the move, and if they caught the scent of an injured lion, they wouldn't hesitate to strike. Time dragged on in the quiet night. Zuri remained awake, every sense heightened. Keanu, though too drained to stay alert, still twitched at the faintest disturbance, his instincts keeping him semi-conscious despite his exhaustion. Then, a sound, subtle, but distinct, broke the silence. Zuri immediately lifted her head, eyes locking onto the darkness beyond the bushes. A shadow moved, an approaching hyena, sniffing at the ground, drawn by the scent of blood. Zuri tensed, muscles coiling beneath her fur. It hadn't seen them yet, but it was close. A lone hyena was cautious, knowing a healthy lion could be a serious threat. However, an injured one might be worth the risk. The wind shifted, carrying their scent directly to the scavenger. Keanu stirred, weakly lifting his head, managing a low growl. The hyena hesitated, taking a slow step forward. Zuri didn't wait. She sprang forward just enough to make her presence undeniable, her mane bristling as she bared her fangs in a threatening display. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from her throat. The hyena stopped in its tracks, reconsidering. The wounded lion was tempting, but the presence of a second, healthy and alert, made the odds less favorable. After a few moments of indecision, it took a step back, then another, before finally slinking away into the shadows. Only when it disappeared did Zuri return to Keanu's side. He had relaxed slightly, though exhaustion still weighed heavily on him. The night was far from over, and greater dangers could still be lurking. But for now, they had survived another test. The first light of dawn stretched across the open grasslands, casting a pale glow over the terrain. Keanu remained motionless, his body heavy with exhaustion. Zuri was the first to rise, stretching out her sore muscles while keeping a sharp watch on their surroundings. They had avoided a deadly encounter last night, but the danger was far from over. Most pressing of all was thirst. The relentless dryness of the land offered no sign of water, and Zuri knew that without it, Keanu's condition would only worsen. She sniffed at the ground, searching for any hint of moisture, but found nothing beyond cracked earth and brittle grass. Keanu stirred, forcing himself upright despite the strain it took. Together, they moved forward, heading toward a distant cluster of trees, perhaps their best chance of finding water. Each step drained Keanu further, but he pushed on without complaint. As they trudged on, they came across faint tracks left by antelope. Instinct told Zuri that water couldn't be too far. Prey animals didn't wander aimlessly where no water existed. They pressed on, but Keanu's pace continued to slow. His breath came in shallow gasps. His mane hung limply over his shoulders. Zuri frequently glanced back, concern deep in her golden eyes. Then, a faint scent carried through the air, the dampness of mud and stagnant water. Zuri froze for a moment, inhaling deeply to confirm it. Water. It wasn't much, but it was something. She quickened her pace, urging Keanu to follow. But when they arrived, hope turned to disappointment. Before them lay a small, murky puddle, its surface thick with mud and debris. It was far from the life-saving oasis they had hoped for. Still, in this unforgiving land, even this filthy water could mean the difference between survival and death. Zuri bent down and lapped cautiously, taking slow, measured sips to minimize the risk of illness. Keanu followed suit, but after just a few gulps, his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed, his body shivering from sheer exhaustion. Zuri moved closer, nudging him with her head as if trying to will strength back into him. But he couldn't rise just yet. They were vulnerable. The scent of damp earth and lingering traces of other animals marked this as a common watering spot. That meant others would be coming, perhaps soon. Zuri stood protectively beside Keanu, ears pricked forward, scanning the horizon. In the distance, shadows flickered along the edge of the grasslands. Hyenas, drawn in by the scent of weakness. Zuri knew, the fight for survival was far from over. Zuri's body was growing weaker with each step. Keanu, though injured and exhausted, kept moving forward, his instincts pushing him onward. The dry plains stretched endlessly before them, broken only by sparse trees and patches of brittle grass. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows as dusk approached. The scent of water reached Zuri's nose first. Her head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. Somewhere ahead, there was a river or a watering hole. The promise of water gave her a burst of energy, and she increased her pace, Keanu following closely behind. As they neared the source, unfamiliar sounds filled the air, deep rumbling noises and the distant hum of voices. The lions hesitated. Their world had always been dictated by natural dangers, rival predators, drought, hunger. But this was different. Through the tall grass, Zuri spotted large, unnatural structures. Strange, metallic creatures moved along a dirt path, kicking up dust as they rumbled past. Nearby, a few figures walked along the edge of a wide river, their silhouettes outlined against the golden sky. Zuri and Keanu instinctively crouched low, watching from a distance. Their ears flicked, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar environment. At the riverbank, two rangers, Ayanda and Thomas, were finishing their evening patrol. Ayanda was the first to notice the footprints, large, distinct marks pressed into the soft earth. She stopped, narrowing her eyes. "Lions," she muttered under her breath. Glancing around cautiously, Thomas followed her gaze, his own expression turning serious. There hadn't been reports of new lions in this region. They worked in a protected reserve, where animals were monitored and tracked. A pair of unknown lions meant something unusual had happened. Following the trail carefully, they moved toward the tall grass. Ayanda suddenly stopped and gestured for Thomas to do the same. Just ahead, half hidden by the swaying vegetation, two golden figures lay motionless. The lions had seen them first. Zuri's muscles tensed, ready to flee, but Keanu barely reacted. He was too weak. His ribs were visible beneath his fur, his wound still raw and unhealed. Ayanda and Thomas remained still, knowing any sudden movement could provoke the animals. They had seen injured lions before. Sometimes they survived, sometimes they didn't, but these two had clearly traveled a great distance. Slowly, Ayanda reached for her radio. "We have two lions near the eastern riverbank," she reported. "One looks injured. They're not aggressive, but we need to monitor them." The radio crackled with a response. "Understood. Keep your distance. If they don't move by morning, we'll call in the vet team." As the sky darkened, Zuri curled her body protectively around Keanu, keeping a wary eye on the humans. She didn't understand what they were, but they hadn't attacked. Ayanda and Thomas backed away, leaving space between them and the lions. For now, all they could do was wait. The night air was cooler, a welcome relief from the heat of the day. Zuri remained alert, her golden eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. Keanu lay still beside her, his breathing shallow but steady. The scent of humans lingered in the air, but they had not approached further. As dawn broke, the world stirred awake. Birds called from the treetops, and the distant grunts of hippos echoed from the river. Zuri's stomach twisted with hunger, but she was too tired to hunt. Keanu was weaker than before, barely lifting his head. Ayanda and Thomas had returned at first light. They observed the lions from a distance, noting Keanu's worsening condition. By mid-morning, the veterinary team arrived, a small group of experts trained to handle wildlife emergencies. The team worked quickly, preparing a dart gun with a sedative. Aiming carefully, one of the veterinarians fired. The dart struck Keanu's shoulder, and he flinched but did not have the strength to resist. Within minutes, his body relaxed. Zuri's ears twitched, her muscles tensing as she watched. She let out a low growl but did not attack. Something deep in her instincts told her these humans were not predators. They did not move toward her, only toward Keanu. The veterinarians moved in, checking his wound. It was infected, the surrounding tissue swollen and inflamed. They cleaned it carefully, applying an antiseptic before giving him an injection of antibiotics. After ensuring his vitals were stable, they placed a small tracking collar around his neck. It was lightweight and designed to fall off after a few months, allowing researchers to monitor his recovery. Satisfied with their work, the team backed away. Keanu would wake up in a few hours. Zuri remained by his side, still wary but unmoving. The humans had helped him, not harmed him. Ayanda and Thomas stayed nearby, ensuring the lions were left undisturbed. The reserve had plenty of prey, and they hoped the lions would regain their strength and adapt to their new territory. As the sun climbed higher, Zuri finally allowed herself to rest, curling up beside Keanu. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense of safety. The struggle for survival was not over. But for now, they had a chance. As the sun climbed higher, its golden rays filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the grass. Zuri lay beside Keanu, her body relaxed but her ears twitching at every sound. Keanu's breathing was steady, his strength slowly returning. The tranquil surroundings of the reserve were a stark contrast to the harsh journey they had endured. In the distance, Ayanda and Thomas continued their silent observation. They had seen many cases like this before, animals struggling to adapt to a new environment. Facing the uncertainties of unfamiliar territory, Zuri had remained alert all night, barely resting, ensuring no danger approached Keanu while he recovered. Hours passed, and Keanu finally stirred. His golden eyes blinked open. Adjusting to the sunlight, he shifted slightly, feeling the soreness in his muscles but also the relief of being alive. Zuri immediately turned toward him, lowering her head and nudging him gently. He lifted his head in response, acknowledging her presence. Though weak, he was regaining his awareness. From a distance, Ayanda noted the change. Keanu was improving, but his body still needed time to heal. The team decided to remain watchful, ensuring that both lions had the best chance of surviving in this new environment. The air carried the scent of dry grass and the distant murmur of water. Birds perched on the branches nearby, their calls blending into the rhythm of the savanna. Zuri stood up, stretching her legs, her eyes scanning the horizon. Despite the uncertainty, there was a sense of quiet resilience between them. Keanu lowered his head back onto his paws, content to rest a little longer, knowing that for now, they were safe. As the sun slowly descended, casting long shadows across the savanna, Ayanda and Thomas knew they had to take the next step. The lions had survived the night, but their bodies still showed signs of exhaustion. They needed food and medical attention, yet neither would be easy to provide. Ayanda carefully signaled to Thomas, and they began their plan. Instead of directly placing food near the lions, which could startle them or make them suspicious, they decided to leave a fresh portion of meat at a reasonable distance, allowing the natural instincts of the animals to guide their reaction. If the lions were too weak or hesitant to approach, they would have to reconsider their strategy. The scent of raw meat soon filled the air. Keanu flicked his ears, his nostrils flaring as the familiar scent reached him. Zuri, who had been resting with her head on her paws, suddenly became alert. Her muscles tensed, and she slowly stood up, her gaze fixed on the food lying just beyond the trees. Hunger gnawed at her, but she hesitated. The presence of humans nearby made her cautious. Thomas and Ayanda remained hidden, observing closely. Zuri took a tentative step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Keanu, still regaining his strength, lifted his head but made no attempt to move yet. His body, though stronger than before, was still in need of rest. For several minutes, Zuri stood motionless, watching for any signs of a trap. She sniffed the air repeatedly, her sharp instincts warning her to be careful. Eventually, the hunger overpowered her wariness, and she took another step. Slowly, she inched forward, muscles poised to flee if necessary. Then, she stopped again. Her golden eyes darted toward the distant patrol vehicle, where Ayanda and Thomas remained concealed. She knew they were there, watching. Would they interfere? Were they a threat? She huffed softly, the sound carrying a mixture of tension and curiosity. Thomas held his breath, resisting the urge to move. Any sudden action could drive the lions away. Instead, he let nature take its course. Zuri eventually reached the meat, circling it before lowering her head to sniff it closely. Another pause, another moment of hesitation. Finally, she took a cautious bite, her teeth sinking into the flesh. The taste reassured her, and she continued eating, though her ears remained pricked, listening for any signs of danger. Keanu watched from his spot under the tree. He wanted to move, to join her, but his body still felt too heavy. He exhaled sharply, frustration evident in the slow movement of his tail against the ground. Zuri, sensing his struggle, lifted her head for a brief moment, glancing toward him before resuming her meal. As the night deepened, Ayanda and Thomas knew their first step had worked. The lions were still cautious, but they had accepted the food. Now came the harder part, getting close enough to provide medical aid without causing panic. As the night deepened, the two rangers remained patient, watching the lions from a distance. The first step had been successful, but their real challenge was far from over. Keanu had yet to eat, and his movements were still slow and weary. His condition worried Ayanda and Thomas. Without enough strength, he wouldn't be able to recover fully. Knowing they couldn't rush things, they decided to leave more food the next day, this time a little closer to where Keanu rested. If they could gradually reduce the distance between themselves and the lions, they might be able to assess his injuries up close. But any wrong move could set their progress back or, worse, cause the lions to flee entirely. At dawn, they carefully placed a fresh piece of meat just a few meters from where Keanu lay. Zuri had accepted the food the previous night, but would she trust them again? More importantly, would Keanu finally have the strength to eat? For a long time, nothing happened. The lions remained still, their golden eyes observing the area cautiously. Then, slowly, Zuri stretched her front legs and rose. She sniffed the air, recognizing the scent of fresh meat again. Her hunger was still present. But this time, she turned to Keanu first. She nudged him slightly with her head. A silent encouragement. Keanu blinked sluggishly. His body still felt heavy. But the scent of food was strong, calling to him. With great effort, he shifted his front paws and tried to rise. His first attempt failed, his muscles trembled, and he slumped back down. Zuri didn't leave his side. She circled him once, then lowered her head next to his, as if urging him to try again. Ayanda and Thomas watched closely, their hands gripping the steering wheel of the vehicle. This was a crucial moment. If Keanu remained too weak, his survival would be at risk. With another deep breath, Keanu tried again. This time, he managed to lift himself slightly, his legs shaky beneath him. He took one step, then another. Slowly, painfully, he inched forward until he reached the meat. Zuri stood beside him as he lowered his head and took his first bite. The relief in Ayanda's eyes was evident. "He's eating," Thomas whispered, barely audible, but they couldn't celebrate just yet. Keanu's movements were unsteady, and he was eating slowly. Something wasn't right. The way he carried his weight suggested an injury, possibly something internal. Ayanda knew they needed to get closer soon, but not yet. They had to let the lions regain their trust in their surroundings first. As the morning sun rose higher, Keanu finished his meal and carefully lowered himself back to the ground. He wasn't fully recovered, but at least he had eaten. That alone was a step forward. Ayanda and Thomas sat quietly in the vehicle, watching from a safe distance. The tension of the past few days had eased slightly now that Keanu had eaten. But their work was far from over. The biggest challenge remained, getting close enough to assess the lion's injuries and determine whether medical intervention was necessary. Back at the reserve's base, Ayanda reviewed the footage they had captured over the past few days. The way Keanu moved, how he shifted his weight when walking, and the careful way he lowered himself to the ground all pointed to a possible leg injury or something more severe, like internal damage. Thomas, standing behind her, crossed his arms thoughtfully. "We need to get closer soon," he said, "but we also can't push them too fast." Ayanda nodded. She had worked with wild animals for years and knew that trust was something built over time. They had to balance caution with urgency. Keanu couldn't afford to be left untreated if he was seriously injured. They decided to introduce their presence more deliberately. Instead of only leaving food and watching from a distance, they would let the lions see them, without making direct moves toward them. This gradual exposure could help reduce their fear of humans, making eventual treatment easier. The next morning, Ayanda and Thomas arrived early, before the sun had fully risen. They parked the vehicle farther away than usual but stepped out this time, keeping a respectful distance. The lions were awake, their golden eyes locked onto the two humans. Keanu remained lying down, but Zuri was already alert, her body tensed. Ayanda moved slowly, placing another portion of food closer than before. Then, instead of retreating immediately, she and Thomas sat down on a large rock nearby. They weren't close enough to be a threat, but they weren't hiding anymore either. Minutes passed. The lions watched them cautiously. Zuri's ears flicked back and forth, gauging the situation. Keanu shifted slightly but didn't attempt to rise yet. "They're watching our every move," Thomas murmured. "That's good," Ayanda replied. "It means they're thinking, not panicking." They remained still for nearly half an hour. The lions didn't come any closer, but they also didn't retreat. When Ayanda and Thomas finally stood and walked back to their vehicle, they felt a small sense of progress. Over the next few days, the routine continued. Each day, Ayanda and Thomas would bring food, sit quietly at a safe distance, and let the lions observe them. Zuri was the first to grow accustomed to their presence. She no longer tensed up immediately when the rangers arrived. Keanu, however, remained more hesitant. His injuries still slowed him down, and he seemed wary of any movement around him. On the fourth day, a small breakthrough occurred. Ayanda placed the food closer than ever before. This time, instead of retreating far away, she stayed only a few meters back. Zuri approached first, but instead of dragging the food away immediately, she stood over it, glancing toward Keanu. Then, something significant happened. She didn't eat first. Instead, she nudged the meat slightly toward Keanu. Ayanda's breath caught in her throat. "He's the priority," Thomas whispered. It was clear now that Zuri was aware of Keanu's weakness and was ensuring he ate first. The bond between them was undeniable. But it also confirmed something troubling. Keanu was still too weak to fight for his own survival. When he finally moved forward and took a bite, the two rangers exchanged relieved glances. It wasn't just about feeding the lions anymore. It was about earning their trust, one small step at a time. The days stretched on, and Ayanda and Thomas maintained their routine, patiently inching closer to the two lions. They had learned to move slowly, never making sudden gestures that might startle the wary animals. Each morning, they arrived just before sunrise, the golden light casting long shadows across the dry grass. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of the African wilderness. They would park the vehicle farther away than before, step out cautiously, and observe. Keanu's condition remained a concern. He still moved stiffly, favoring one leg, and while he was eating more regularly now, his energy had not fully returned. One morning, Thomas noticed something troubling. As Keanu attempted to rise, his legs wobbled beneath him, and he collapsed back onto the ground with a soft thud. Zuri, who had been standing nearby, immediately turned to him, her posture tense with concern. Ayanda's stomach tightened. "That's not good," she murmured. "No, it's not," Thomas agreed, his eyes narrowing. "We might not be able to wait much longer." They had hoped Keanu would regain strength naturally. But now it was clear, if they didn't intervene soon, he might not make it. That evening, back at the reserve's medical station, Ayanda and Thomas discussed their options with Dr. Patel, the lead veterinarian. "We need to dart him," Dr. Patel said bluntly. "If he can't move well, he's not hunting, and if he's not hunting, he's not healing." Thomas sighed. "The problem is getting close enough. Right now, they tolerate us, but if we suddenly pull out a rifle and fire a tranquilizer dart, we could break whatever fragile trust we've built." Ayanda nodded. "We have to do this carefully. Maybe get them used to the presence of new objects first. Let them see us holding something in our hands so that when the time comes." "The dart gun doesn't seem foreign or threatening," Dr. Patel agreed. "That could work, but we can't afford to wait too long. If that leg is infected, every day we delay is dangerous." Over the next 2 days, Ayanda and Thomas slowly introduced new elements into their routine. They carried small, harmless objects, wooden sticks, rolled up papers, making sure the lions saw them before setting them down. The goal was simple: to desensitize them to the sight of humans holding unfamiliar items. At first, Zuri remained suspicious. She would lower her body, ears twitching, ready to flee, but after a few days, she stopped reacting as strongly. Keanu, as always, was more reserved, but he was too weak to show much resistance. Finally, on the third day, it was time. The morning was still and quiet. The distant sounds of birds and insects filled the air as Ayanda and Thomas positioned themselves at their usual spot. Dr. Patel was with them this time, rifle in hand, a tranquilizer dart loaded and ready. Zuri and Keanu were lying in the shade of a large acacia tree. The position was good. Keanu was partially shielded by the tree trunk. But if they timed it right, Dr. Patel could get a clear shot. The challenge was ensuring that Zuri didn't interfere. If she saw the darting as an attack, she could become aggressive. Ayanda moved first. She placed the morning's meal closer than before, stepping back with deliberate slowness. Zuri's eyes flicked between the food and the humans, but she didn't move forward immediately. Keanu, exhausted, didn't react much at all. Dr. Patel took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and pulled the trigger. The dart flew silently through the air, striking Keanu's hindquarters. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Keanu jolted, a sharp growl escaping him as he twisted his head to see what had happened. Zuri jumped to her feet, tense and alert. Ayanda held her breath. Keanu tried to stand, but his weak legs betrayed him. The tranquilizer was fast-acting. Within moments, his body began to relax, his movements slowing, his head drooped, and then, finally, he collapsed onto the ground. Zuri took a cautious step toward him, sniffing the dart, then looking at the humans with narrowed eyes. "Let's move in," Dr. Patel whispered. Ayanda and Thomas followed him, approaching with careful but firm steps. They had only a small window of time before the sedation wore off. As they reached Keanu's side, Ayanda crouched down, her hands already moving to examine his injured leg. What she saw made her heart sink, deep scratches and puncture wounds, some showing signs of infection. He wouldn't have lasted much longer, she muttered. Thomas nodded grimly. Let's work fast. And so, under the vast African sky, they began the delicate process of treating the fallen king. Dr. Patel quickly pulled out his medical supplies, his hands swift yet careful as he examined Keanu's wound. Although the anesthesia had taken effect, they could not afford to waste time. The sooner they treated the injury, the higher Keanu's chances of recovery. Ayanda cleaned the area around the wound, taking care not to cause further pain. The claw marks and bite wounds were deeper than they had expected, likely the result of a fight with another male lion or a dangerous encounter with hyenas. Sand and dust had clung to the wound, worsening the infection. Thomas held the medical bag open, allowing Ayanda to grab whatever she needed quickly. When the antiseptic touched the lion's skin, Keanu's body twitched slightly, though he remained still under the effects of the sedative. Ayanda glanced at Dr. Patel, who nodded, signaling that this reaction was normal. They continued working in silence, with only the sound of the wind sweeping across the grasslands and the distant noises of the surrounding wildlife. Thomas took the bandages and carefully wrapped the wound after they had thoroughly cleaned it. To prevent further infection, Dr. Patel administered antibiotics directly into Keanu's body before inspecting him carefully to ensure no additional wounds had been overlooked. Zuri remained at a distance, watching them intently. She did not attack, but her eyes remained full of caution. Each time Ayanda or Thomas made a sudden movement, Zuri inched forward slightly, ready to react. Once everything was completed, they quickly packed up their supplies and stepped back to a safe distance to wait for the sedative to wear off. Time passed slowly. The sun had risen higher, its heat becoming more intense. But no one left. Keanu's body started to show small signs of movement, first a slight twitch of his ears, then a faint flutter of his eyelids. Zuri moved closer, sniffing him before gently rubbing her head against his neck, as if checking on him. Thomas held his breath, watching Keanu's reaction as he attempted to lift his head but was still too weak to stand. Ayanda turned to Dr. Patel. Will he be able to move soon? He needs time, Dr. Patel replied, but if we got to him in time, he has a good chance of recovery. Keanu tried again, this time managing to lift his front legs. Zuri remained by his side, never taking her eyes off him. When they saw Keanu finally manage to stand, though slightly unsteady, Ayanda let out a breath of relief. At least now he had a chance to survive. But the challenge remained. If Keanu could not regain his strength and hunt again, he would not last long. They would have to keep watching. Over the next few days, Ayanda, Thomas, and Dr. Patel continued to monitor Keanu's condition from a distance. He was improving but still weak, often lying in the shade to rest while Zuri remained by his side. They left fresh water and small portions of meat nearby, ensuring he had enough strength to recover without making him dependent on human intervention. One morning, Ayanda observed Keanu attempting to walk further from the shaded spot where he had been resting. His steps were slow and unsteady, but it was progress. Zuri stayed close, her movements protective, guiding him as they moved. Dr. Patel, watching through binoculars, nodded in approval. He's regaining his strength, but he's not ready to hunt yet. Thomas lowered his camera. If he doesn't recover fully, will Zuri leave him behind? Ayanda shook her head. Unlikely. They've been together too long. But survival comes first in the wild. If he doesn't recover, she may be forced to move on. That was the harsh reality of nature. The lions formed deep bonds. They could not afford to care for those who could no longer provide for themselves. A few days later, a sign of real progress appeared. In the fading evening light, Keanu moved closer to a watering hole for the first time since his injury. Zuri followed, her ears twitching as she remained alert to potential dangers. Though his legs still trembled slightly, Keanu lowered his head and drank deeply, the rippling water reflecting the colors of the sunset. Dr. Patel and the team watched from a safe distance, feeling relieved but still cautious. The next challenge would be whether Keanu could eat properly and regain his full strength. They could not intervene too much. His survival had to depend on his own resilience. For now, They would continue to watch and wait. As the days passed, Keanu's strength gradually returned, but his full recovery remained uncertain. Though he was moving better, his energy was still limited, and his muscles had not fully regained their former power. The team knew that without a successful hunt soon, his progress could stall. One evening, as Ayanda and Thomas observed from a distance, Zuri suddenly became tense. Her ears flicked, and she stood alert, staring into the distance. A low, guttural growl rumbled in her throat. "What is it?" Thomas whispered. Ayanda lifted her binoculars and scanned the horizon. A group of hyenas had appeared at the edge of the watering hole. There were at least 6 of them, moving cautiously but purposefully. Dr. Patel sighed. "That's not good." Hyenas were not the most dangerous predators. But in a pack, they were bold and opportunistic. If they sensed Keanu's weakness, they would not hesitate to attack. Zuri positioned herself in front of Keanu. Her muscles tensed. Keanu, though still weak, let out a warning snarl. But it lacked the power of his usual roar. The hyenas hesitated but did not retreat. The team watched anxiously. They could not interfere directly, it was against their conservation ethics, but they also did not want to see Keanu fall victim to scavengers. The standoff lasted several long minutes. The hyenas tested the situation. Moving closer in small, calculated steps, Zuri lashed her tail, a clear sign of warning. But she was outnumbered. Just as the tension reached its peak, a deep, rumbling roar echoed across the plains. It was not Keanu's. A massive male lion emerged from the tall grass, his mane thick and dark, his body powerful and unscarred. He strode forward with confidence. His eyes locked on the hyenas. The scavengers hesitated for a moment. Then one by one, they turned and slunk away, knowing they had no chance against such a formidable opponent. Ayanda exhaled in relief. That was close. But as the new lion approached, Zuri and Keanu did not relax. This was not a friend, it was another challenge. A dominant male could see Keanu as weak competition and might try to take Zuri for himself. Keanu, despite his exhaustion, straightened his posture, standing tall despite the pain. Zuri did not back away, but she kept her body tense. The new lion came closer, sniffing the air. The next few moments would determine their fate. The tension in the air was palpable as the large lion slowly approached. His golden eyes flickered between Keanu and Zuri, assessing the situation. The presence of an injured male and a lone female was an unusual sight. The stranger's posture was relaxed, yet dominant. He was not in a hurry, but he was clearly testing the waters. Keanu, despite his weakened state, did not back down. His instincts screamed at him to stand his ground. Though his ribs still ached from the injury, he took a slow step forward, planting his paws firmly into the dry earth. His breathing was labored, but his message was clear. He was still here, still willing to fight if necessary. Zuri remained tense, her ears flicking back and forth. If Keanu lost this challenge, she had no doubt that the stranger would forcefully take over. The law of the wild was brutal. Only the strongest males secured territory and mates. She let out a low growl, not to threaten, but as a warning. The new lion continued his approach, stopping just a few feet away. His powerful frame was evident, muscles rippling beneath his tawny coat. He inhaled deeply, catching Keanu's scent, and then glanced at Zuri. It was clear he was weighing his options. A long, silent moment stretched between them. The humans, watching from a safe distance, held their breath. Ayanda knew they could not interfere. This was nature unfolding in its rawest form. Then, without warning, the stranger suddenly turned away. He flicked his tail once, dismissing them as unworthy of his interest. Perhaps he had judged Keanu too weak to be a real threat. Or perhaps he simply had no interest in taking over. Whatever his reason, he strolled away without a fight. Keanu remained standing for a moment longer, his body rigid with tension. When he was sure the threat was gone, he let out a slow exhale and lowered himself carefully to the ground. The moment had passed, but it had been a close call. Ayanda and Thomas exchanged glances. That could have gone a lot worse. Thomas muttered. Dr. Patel nodded. But Keanu still needs to regain his strength. He won't be so lucky next time. As night fell, the team decided to leave additional food closer to Keanu's resting place. Though they wanted to keep their interference minimal, they knew he needed the extra help. A fresh carcass was placed a short distance away, close enough for him to reach, but not so close that he wouldn't have to move for it. The next morning, as the sun cast golden light over the savannah, they observed from a distance. Keanu had eaten some of the meat, though he had left a portion untouched, perhaps to conserve his energy. Zuri remained by his side, alert and watchful, but nature was never predictable. A new challenge was on the horizon. The tension in the air was unmistakable. Over the past few nights, the presence of scavengers had grown. While Zuri remained vigilant, exhaustion was beginning to wear on her. She could not fight off the endless threats forever. And Keanu was still too weak to defend himself. One evening, as the light faded, movement flickered at the edges of the tall grass. A group of hyenas crept closer, their yellow eyes glinting with hunger. Unlike before, they did not hesitate. Their patience had run out, and they were ready to test their luck. Zuri bristled, her muscles tensing as she positioned herself between Keanu and the approaching threat. She let out a deep growl. Her ears flattened against her skull. The largest of the hyenas stepped forward, baring its teeth, its body language aggressive. For the first time, Keanu attempted to rise. His legs trembled under his own weight, but he forced himself up. Standing on shaky limbs, the hyenas hesitated. Even weak, Keanu was still a lion, a predator they did not want to challenge unless absolutely necessary. A standoff began. Zuri and Keanu, though exhausted, refused to back down. The hyenas, sensing their hesitation, crept forward inch by inch. From a distance, Ayanda and the others watched, their expressions grim. They had hoped to let nature take its course, but they could not allow Keanu to be overwhelmed like this. Dr. Patel exhaled slowly. A distraction might be enough. We don't need to intervene directly. Just shift the balance. Ayanda nodded. Without hesitation, Thomas climbed into the truck and turned on the engine. The loud roar of the vehicle cut through the night, startling the hyenas. Then, with a sudden flash of headlights and a sharp honk, the humans made their presence known. The hyenas flinched, their confidence wavering. A few turned and bolted immediately. The largest hesitated for a moment longer, eyeing Keanu as if calculating the risk. But in the end, it too gave up and slunk away into the darkness. Zuri remained in a defensive stance for several moments longer before finally relaxing. Keanu, drained from the effort of standing, sank back to the ground. From a safe distance, the humans let out a quiet breath of relief. They had not intervened too much, just enough to prevent an unfair fight. But they all knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The real battle for survival was far from over. Days turned into weeks as Keanu gradually regained his strength. With careful intervention from the research team, he received the necessary sustenance to recover. Zuri remained close, her watchful eyes never straying far from him. Though wary at first, both lions slowly adapted to the presence of the humans who had, in their own way, become part of their survival story. The researchers maintained a delicate balance, providing aid without interfering too much. Over time, Keanu's wounds healed, his body filled out, and his movements became steadier. He was no longer the weakened lion struggling to stay alive. One morning, as the golden light of dawn spread across the savannah, he rose to his feet with renewed strength. From a distance, Ayanda watched, a quiet satisfaction in her heart. The entire team had dedicated themselves to this moment, to see Keanu stand tall once more. Dr. Patel made his final notes, confirming that the lions were now self-sufficient. The time for human intervention was over. That afternoon, as the research vehicle prepared to leave, Zuri and Keanu stood atop a small hill, looking toward the humans one last time. There was no fear, no hesitation, only understanding. As the wind swept through the grass, the two lions turned away, disappearing into the endless expanse of the wild, where they belonged. Ayanda smiled, knowing their work had been worth it. The savannah had reclaimed its hunters, and life would go on. As the dust settled behind the research vehicle, Ayanda sat in silence, watching the endless stretch of golden grass swaying in the wind. The lions had disappeared into the wilderness, but their presence lingered in her thoughts. She had spent months witnessing their struggle, their resilience, and their eventual return to strength. It was a story of survival, not just of the lions but also of the delicate balance between human intervention and nature's unbreakable will. There was a lesson in all of this. one that extended beyond the savanna. Keanu and Zuri had not been saved through force but through patience, respect, and an understanding of their instincts. Had the team interfered too much, they could have driven the lions away or made them dependent on human aid. Instead, they provided just enough support to give them a fighting chance, then stepped back when it was time. Ayanda had seen too many instances where humans overstepped their boundaries, believing themselves to be the saviors of nature. But true conservation was not about control, it was about coexistence. The wild did not need domination, it needed respect. The lions were not pets. Nor were they spectacles for human admiration. They were living beings with their own paths. And today, they had been given the chance to walk them once more. Dr. Patel broke the silence. "Will they be okay?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "They were okay long before we arrived," Ayanda replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "We just gave them a little help when they needed it." As the vehicle drove away, she reflected on the deeper meaning of their work. Every living creature fought its own battles, whether in the vastness of the savanna or the concrete jungles of human civilization. Sometimes, a helping hand was necessary, but it was never meant to replace the strength that already existed within. She thought of the next group of animals they would study, the next challenge they would face. There would always be more stories like Keanu and Zuri's tales of endurance, struggle, and the power of life to persevere. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Ayanda felt a quiet certainty. The work of conservation was never truly done, but it was always worth it. As the days passed, Keanu and Zuri gradually regained their strength. Their wounds healed, their fur regained its former sheen, and their steps became firmer. The harsh times they had endured had left scars, but they were no longer weak, no longer on the brink of despair. Under the golden sun of the savanna, they moved together once more, their bond unbroken despite all they had faced. Keanu's powerful frame led the way, while Zuri followed closely, her movements fluid and confident. They no longer needed the food left by humans, no longer sought shelter near the research camp. Their instincts had fully returned, guiding them back into the vast wilderness where they belonged. One morning, as Ayanda and her team observed from a distance, Keanu and Zuri approached a large acacia tree. There, a small group of lions, females and cubs, watched them warily. Keanu stood still for a moment, his posture neither aggressive nor submissive. He had once been a leader, and perhaps he could be again. Zuri, too, showed no hesitation. For a long moment, the air was tense. Then, a lioness from the group took a few cautious steps forward. She sniffed the air, assessing Keanu, before turning back toward the others. Slowly, the pride began to relax. The cubs, sensing no immediate threat, curiously observed the newcomers. Ayanda smiled. This was the moment she had been hoping for. Keanu and Zuri were not just surviving, they were reclaiming their place in the wild. They were no longer alone. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Keanu and Zuri lay down near the pride, their eyes calm, their bodies at rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new hunts, new battles, but tonight, they were home, and that was all that mattered. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of Keanu and Zuri. Their story is a testament to resilience, survival, and the beauty of the wild. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing wildlife stories. And if you found this story truly inspiring, comment the number 2 below to let us know. Your support helps us continue sharing these incredible moments from nature. See you in the next video.